All right. Well, I see people are still dropping in a little bit, but I want to welcome everyone to this eighth FIA Summer Sessions. I'm Charlie Salonius Pasternak. I'm lead researcher on the Center on U.S. Power and Politics. The idea of the center is basically to work as a hub for U.S. research at FIA, at the Institute. We have about 5-person core staff, one or two visiting fellows who are made possible by funding from the ERCO Foundation. Now, the summer sessions, as I said, this is the 8th iteration. The idea was originally just to get people from different backgrounds, policy, politicians, research communities, businesses, give a place to discuss the world, the US. And this year, we're trying to explore how the US role is looking and potentially going to evolve in terms of a global perspective. Today's second panel, the first having been on transatlantic global and trade, is certainly a hot button issue topic, European strategic autonomy. And as everyone who's followed the news has noted that there are a few global events that have brought this again to the fore. Now, I'm going to leave the introductions to Nicholas, who's also a lead researcher at FIA, specifically on this topic. But I wanted to take the opportunity to thank you, Nicholas, for pulling together a great panel, my fellow CUSP staff, but especially Mayu Hinsberg for ensuring that all of this actually works. So with that, Nicholas, take it away, and I wish you a barnstormer of a panel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charlie, for this opening words. So my name is Niklas Helbig, and I'm a leading researcher here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And this is the second panel of this year's Helsinki Summer Session. And yeah, very, very warm welcome to all the people in the audience. As Charlie mentioned, the topic of this session is European strategic autonomy. What can we agree on? And I'm really happy that we have this great panel of distinguished European as well as US experts to discuss this issue. We are still waiting for the third panelist. He will join us a little bit later, Daniel Hamilton, but we already have Benjamin Haddad and Christy Reich here with us. So if you have not been living under a rock in the last couple of years, you will by now definitely heard about this idea of European strategic autonomy. It's the buzzword in the moment in the European foreign policy community, and it discusses how Europe can enhance its ability to act more independently in today's world. And this idea is not new at all, right? So in the area of security and defense, we have already in the 90s started to talk about this issue. When we remember the St. Malo summit from 1998, when the leaders called upon the EU to develop the capacity for autonomous action, it was already discussed that the EU should step up its role in security and defense. And in recent years, this discussion on European strategic autonomy has broadened quite a lot. It also now includes technological consideration. It includes issues of trade. And it also reflects that Europe has become much more worried about its dependence, its economic dependence, for example, on China. And I have here at FIA the opportunity to lead a research project that looks more at this broader concept of European strategic autonomy and what it means for the European Union. And just as a side note, we published a report, a comprehensive report this May, which you can find on the FIA website in case you are interested. But for today's panel, we want to specifically focus on the area of security and defense and what the European strategic autonomy debate entails in this area. And one can actually argue that, especially when it comes to security and defense, the idea of strategic autonomy is quite controversial and quite contested amongst member states of the EU. You know, you have the division between the more Atlanticist-oriented member states and those who have a more European focus. You have different threat perceptions across Europe, so you have also different priorities on defense matters. So the question, what really should be the priorities of a strategic autonomous Europe? How should the relationship with the US be in the future? They are seen differently across capitals in the EU. Yeah, Charlie already mentioned that there's it's a especially interesting time to discuss these issues. Some of you might have seen that today Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the EU, published an op-ed in the New York Times saying that Afghanistan should be Europe's wake-up call. Yeah, but what are the lessons from Afghanistan? I think that is something we were going to discuss today as well. Why have previous efforts not worked to build up strategic autonomy? Why was Europe again in the position that it was? Should Europe continue to build mainly on the transatlantic alliance when enhancing its defense capabilities? Or has maybe Afghanistan shown the opposite, and Europe should learn to stand more on its own feet? What can the EU, on the one hand, realistically contribute to European security and defense, and where should maybe the European pillar of NATO be strengthened? So these are very, very broad but crucial questions, and I hope that we get some interesting insights today from our panelists. And I hope that we also get maybe some different perspectives because our panelists today have different backgrounds. So first, we're going to have a discussion on the panel. And for the second part of this session, there will be a question and answer possibility. And for this, I would like to ask the audience to use the chat function to type out your questions there. And I'm going to introduce them to the speakers then towards the end of the seminar. So please use the chat function. And if you could also state your affiliation, that would be great. And you can start typing away your questions anytime you like. Our first intervention will come from Benjamin Haddad, who is the director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council. He is really a prominent face in the DC think tank environment, especially when it comes to these transatlantic relations issues. But he's also very well connected in Paris, and he follows very closely the European discussion, whether in Paris or in Brussels. So, Benjamin, you can really provide us with this unique French-American perspective on today's topic. I saw that today the former French ambassador to DC tweeted, "Wake up, Europe, your nanny has resigned." So why haven't we listened earlier to the French maybe on this European strategic autonomy issue? Or what is your perspective? Please give us your initial thoughts.
Well, thanks, Niklas, and it's great to be here. A few words, and then we could move into a conversation. Obviously, this is a very timely moment to have this conversation. It's been really striking to hear what we've heard coming out of London and Berlin. Two capitals that have invested heavily in terms of political capital, in terms of troops, in terms of funding, of course, to the operation in Afghanistan. Mostly out of solidarity with the alliance. And I think we've been traumatized by the unilateral way in which the withdrawal decision was first made and then implemented by the administration. And I think what it shows is that, we see a clear trend over the last few administrations, first President Obama, then President Trump, then President Biden, that there's little political appetite for military intervention coming from U.S. administration, especially in areas in, the neighborhood of Europe, if you will, areas that have maybe more direct consequences in terms of security or in terms of refugees for Europe than they will have for the United States. And what has really struck me if we talk about Afghanistan, the reaction from Europeans, is that it's very much sort of a remake of what we've seen in 2018 with the U.S. withdrawal from northeast Syria, which was already heavily criticized in Europe. And here again, where Europeans were powerless to affect change and shape their environment, and we're going to bear the brunt of a security crisis in their environment. And this leads me to talk about strategic autonomy. I think this is a concept that's often misunderstood, that's often poorly explained too. You asked why don't we listen to the French? Well, the French are not always very good at explaining, or not always very good at building coalitions also that take into account the interest and the security concerns of some of their partners, especially, I would say, we can go into more detail on this, in Central and Eastern Europe. So there's been some ambiguity about what it means. But I think what it means, if you just define it in its narrow definition, it means that Europeans should be able to, when necessary, to defend their interest and their security, especially when the US is not interested or has not put it as a priority. I don't see it at all as a project that goes against the alliance or against the US. On the contrary, as something that would strengthen the alliance. The United States needs robust allies. It needs autonomous allies that can bring value added. And especially as the US shifts its attention to Asia, strategic competition with China, but also just to domestic issues. I mean, this Biden administration is not first and foremost concerned with China. It's first and foremost concerned, as it should be, with COVID recovery, vaccination, infrastructure spending, a lot of the things that have led to the Trump election in 2016, infrastructure inequalities in the United States. And so that's also a message that European should hear. I think a good precedent for me on a lower scale of what we could achieve in the next decade or so, a good precedent is the Operation in the Sahel, which is a European operation. You have, troops from sort of all over Europe, but that is also supported by the United States, supported with intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. So it fits within the global U.S. architecture and U.S. War on terror, but led by Europeans. This is, I think, a good example where European can take the lead, can act when the U.S. doesn't want to step up directly, but at the same time, it's articulated within the alliance, so there's no contradiction. Because otherwise, we end up in situations where we are powerless, as we've seen in Afghanistan or in Syria, to just even evacuate Afghans who have worked with British troops or German troops, and we end up with a strategic but also a human tragedy. So I think we do need to draw the conclusions of this, and I think it will have long-term consequences. I think in many respects, this episode will have, I think, a deeper impact than the Trump presidency, were it only because it happens after the Trump presidency, so there's a cumulative effect, but also because it happens in the presidency, where America is back and allies and the defense of liberal democracy was at the top of the rhetoric, and now we see the reality of this withdrawal. So I think it will be a form. It will take time, but it will be a form of wake-up call for Europeans.
Yeah, thank you so much, Benjamin, for this initial thoughts. I'm going to turn now to Christy. So you heard Benjamin explaining very well that Afghanistan has been a traumatizing event for people in London, people looking from Berlin, and that there are also some underlying trends in the US that in the future might turn the US attention from Europe away. So it will be really interesting now to hear from you. How is this seen from a Baltic perspective then, where the transatlantic alliance, of course, is an integral part of your security in the Baltic region?
Thank you, Niklas, and many thanks to FIA for inviting me. It's always great to see old colleagues, and I get this feeling that I miss you, I miss FIA. We had a great time there, but always nice to be back. Thanks to Benjamin. I think there are several points where we agree, but then there are differences of perspective. And thanks for defining the European strategic autonomy, so I don't have to get into that. But my starting point actually in this discussion is that European strategic autonomy is something that does not exist in reality. It exists in discourse, it's an aspiration, but there is so much work to be done to actually be able to seriously speak about strategically autonomous Europe. There is work to be done first on capabilities, as we all know. Secondly, perhaps even more difficult is work on political unity and developing a shared strategic culture that we have so much been talking about, to have a better, stronger shared threat assessments, and to kind of have a joint European definition of what our interests are. I think we have an understanding of what our European values are that we want to defend, and that it's in our interest to defend them, but how exactly and where then are the priorities and what are the suitable instruments? That's far more difficult to agree upon. And thirdly, also there is a lot of work to be done more on a kind of broader societal level to develop this political resolve in Europe, to actually be ready to use the capabilities and the instruments that Europeans already have, and then to make a difference on the global stage. And it's a big, like a mental or intellectual challenge for Europeans who, like myself, who studied international relations in the post-Cold War era when the world was uniquely favorable to Europe, to European security. And we could all kind of spend years discussing European normative power and civilian power, and whether Europe can be a different kind of power in international relations, different from the kind of traditional great powers. And now we are really struggling to redefine the European approach and cope in the world where we have hostility between major powers, and we as Europeans can't just step aside and not take sides and try to stay away from it. So we are in a much more hostile environment for our values and for our understanding of what the rules-based order in the world should look like. And in this situation, there is still, of course, a lot that we share with the US. So this is the kind of more global picture. But now getting closer to home, seen from Tallinn, we have still the same security environment as we had 1 month or 1 year or 5 years ago. We have a big neighbor that behaves aggressively, that breaks rules, that uses force and all sorts of hybrid instruments to undermine Western societies. And for us, this is the #1 existential threat. And I don't want to sound alarmist. There is no need to be alarmist, but it's always there, and it's something that needs to be managed. And it has not been changed by the Trump administration. It has not been changed by withdrawal from Afghanistan, that for the Baltic states, NATO is the main framework for defense and deterrence vis-à-vis Russia, and the role of the US remains indispensable in foreseeable future. This is just a fact, and the only thing that can change this would be a substantial increase in capabilities and commitments of European allies. And we just don't see this happening anytime soon. It's a very slow process. And of course, in the Baltics, we also have our questions about how long-lasting and how certain the US commitment to our security is. And these questions are becoming kind of more strongly heard and more acknowledged. But we also have to ask, so could we rely more on France or Germany? And that's also a difficult question. And at the moment, it's very clearly the US that so far has stood behind its commitment and has the capabilities that are needed to defend NATO's eastern flank. Now, having said that, I think in Estonia, we do have a very clear understanding that we need to take a broad view on European security. And we need to take seriously the security concerns that allies have in southern parts of Europe, in all countries. And Estonia has very concretely also shown this readiness to take part in addressing the security concerns of other allies. The Estonian-French defense cooperation is very close, it's very deep. Estonia has been together with the French in Mali, and France is really appreciating that. And the kind of discussion and contacts between Paris and Tallinn are very good. But this still doesn't mean that there would be a shared view on what European strategic autonomy means. And there is this sense in the Baltic states that Paris does not listen to our views enough. So there is work to be done, and I think on both sides. And when you ask about priorities and frameworks for European strategic autonomy, I think we can also here see the difference between the Eastern and Southern dimension, or Eastern and Southern European countries, that in the South, NATO cannot play the same kind of role as it does in the East. It does not, and it will not. So the question of what more the European Union can do and how to strengthen European strategic autonomy in the kind of Southern European context is a very relevant one, and really needs to be addressed in the EU framework. And one more point before I stop and look forward to discussion. I think one aspect of developing this sense of strategic autonomy is that as Europeans, we kind of need to learn to think more on our own. It has been a very common argument, especially in the Baltics, but I think also in Germany, to do various things in international security in order to be good allies. I mean, go to Afghanistan because you want to be a good ally. Take part in different operations in faraway places because you want to be a good ally. And this is a kind of very understandable argument, especially for small states that rely so much on NATO and the US. But we need to develop our own thinking through our strategic interests and why we get engaged somewhere. And this is also very much relevant in the context of the rise of Chinese influence. And again, too often I hear in Estonian debate, for example, that we need to pay attention to China now because this is the main challenge for the US. I think this is not good enough as an argument. And we really need to think through how the rise of China poses challenges to European security and European way of life and European democracy. And what are then the instruments that we have to address these challenges? I will stop here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristi. First of all, I have to apologize that I did not introduce you properly when it was your turn, and probably that is because everyone knows you here so much in the Baltic Nordic discussion. You're such a prominent face that I didn't even state your affiliation. But of course, you are the director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute in Tallinn. And before that, as you mentioned, you were a senior research fellow here at FIA, and you have widely published, as anyone knows who's dealing with these issues, on EU foreign policy, Baltic security, and EU-Russia relations. So just to get this out, sorry for not introducing you, but everyone knows you by now. And thank you so much for your first points. What really came out clearly was, of course, the Baltic focus on on territorial defense or the threat from Russia, which, as you said, is an existential issue from a Baltic perspective. So what I clearly see here in this discussion are already two kind of different aspects of European strategic autonomy that have been developing over the last 10 to 20 years. One is this issue of out of area operations and the questions of crisis management, where the EU tried to be more active, but has also similar tendencies like the US to look more inward and to be less willing to engage. Think about the whole discussion around Libya, think about the whole discussion about Syria, and now recently Afghanistan. The second aspect is also something that has developed hugely in the last decade. That is the question of territorial defense and how to deal with Russia in the future, and all the developments that we have seen in the European context since 2014. And it seems to me like the question of European strategic autonomy really centers around those two issues and whether there can be a common or overlapping perspective by member states on how to tackle this. So I think my question to Benjamin would be, Kristi mentioned already that Estonia or the Baltic countries don't really see the alternative to the US in security umbrella, don't see, for example, Germany, or don't see French security guarantees as similar to what they get into in NATO's Article 5 and the US security umbrella. So would you say that part of the issue why there hasn't been more positive development in Europe, it was also that France didn't take the security concerns of maybe Baltic countries, Central and Eastern member states more serious? What would you advise French policymakers in that regard?
Yeah, well, Kristi mentioned the quality of Franco-Estonian relations and the presence of Estonian troops in Mali. So I think, unfortunately for your debate, I am gonna celebrate this Franco-Estonian relationship by agreeing with a lot of what Kristi just said. I mean, a few points on this. I mean, first, clearly, this vision of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty, or however we want to call it, it is aspirational. It is an objective. It's a generational struggle, and unfortunately, I think, you know, even some of the efforts of the last few years that have gone in the right direction have clearly not been, I think, ambitious enough when you compare to the challenges that we're facing. You know, we talk a lot about some of the developments of EU institutions like PESCO and EDF, but, you know, unfortunately, the EDF budget was halved during the budgetary negotiations at the European Parliament, and, you know, it's only 7 billion euros. I mean, all of this is just not up to the challenges that we are facing. When it comes to territorial defense and the question of NATO Article 5, I think there's absolutely no question of trying to replace that by either France, Germany, or European strategic autonomy, or whoever else. You know, when you listen to President Biden's speech of yesterday, for example, which I think was a very blunt, but at the same time, a very articulate explanation of his foreign policy doctrine and vision. You know, he talked about concentrating on vital national interests. So it is a pretty narrow definition of why the US would go to war, much narrower than what we've seen in the last 30 years, including from Joe Biden himself. But I do think that NATO Article 5 is clearly part of what he would call vital national interest. I mean, he's said so in the past. And the defense security guarantees from the United States within NATO are really existential for the U.S. They're part of the U.S. security order. If the U.S. were not to guarantee them, I mean, you know, all of the credibility and the alliance structure of the United States, including in the Asia Pacific, I think would collapse. So I think there's no question. And if you look at, you know, France, it's really important to remember. I mean, France joined back the NATO military command in 2008 under President Sarkozy. It's now actually a very active member of NATO. It does have troops within forward presence in Estonia and Lithuania, I think, as well. Not enough, I think, but I'll go back to that a little later. But it is present, and it's working closely with NATO. The French military actually enjoys a very strong bilateral relationship with the American military. Same thing for intelligence relations and the coalition against ISIS, anti-terrorism. So here, just the quality of the Franco-American relationship in this respect showed that there's absolutely no contradiction between developing your own strategic autonomy and at the same time being a strong ally. I would actually say these two things reinforce each other. And when we talk mostly about strategic autonomy, I think we mean things that are sort of below Article 5 level. So not major strategic threats such as Russia, but as you said, out of area operation, crisis management on the border. What worries me in the future is, as I said, not so much Article 5, but if tomorrow you have another crisis in Libya, in the East Med, in the Western Balkans, who knows? I mean, like in the 90s, I don't think we would see a lot of political appetite, left or right, in the United States to intervene on behalf of European security. And one thing I would slightly question, and not so much from what was said today, but what we usually hear is that these areas are mostly of concern to Paris or to Western Europeans. But if you think of Syria and the migration crisis, I mean, if there's one thing that I think all 28, I mean, Britain at the time, public opinions could agree on was that there was a major migration crisis, that it had impact on European societies. And it was the consequence of a foreign policy crisis on which Europeans were powerless. So I think this is mostly what we're talking about. Now, Nicholas, I'm not going to avoid your question, though, because I do think you point to something that is really key and that I've written about. I do think one of the reasons why France has not been as good as it could be to make its case is because we've had a generational missed opportunity. This is not about the current president or even his predecessor, but I think for the last 30 years, France has not invested enough in its relationship in Central and Eastern Europe. It's not been, I think, sensitive enough to the security concerns or just even to the history of the region. I think there's been an incredible missed opportunity here to build ties with countries that have a strong defense and security culture. Maybe I think there was distrust on both sides. I think clearly for a long time the French elite was skeptical of enlargement, to speak very bluntly, because of EU enlargement more than NATO enlargement. NATO enlargement has never been so much an issue in Paris, but of EU enlargement, because it was seen as diluting decision making, making the EU more burdensome, and instead of just realizing that it was I think how would I say it, a historical responsibility that we had, of course, and investing in relationships. Estonia is one of the exceptions, I would say, although there's still work to be done. But I think there is clearly at the defense level, if you go to the French Ministry of Defense, there's a tremendous esteem and respect for Estonian counterparts, but I think we could just do better. And this, by the way, I mean, conversations like these are useful in this respect. I mean, I've worked in the United States for the better part of the last decade, and often visit Central and Eastern European as a representative of an American organization. I'm often the only French, or one of the few French at these different forums or conferences. So I think I think people are starting to realize this and understanding you need to invest, including these personal exchanges and relationships. But there's still some work to be done. And I think the President Macron's opening to Russia I think it's much more cautious than it is often described to be, but it's clearly not been well explained or understood in that part of Europe.
Yeah, thank you. I think this also reminds me of another exercise that's going on in Europe in the moment, which is the Strategic Compass exercise, which was initiated by the French together with the Germans, and of course will come to an end under the French presidency, EU presidency next year. So that is, of course, also maybe another opportunity for France when they anyways hold the EU presidency, where you have to have an inclusive approach to reach out more also, if that was really lacking, like you mentioned, to maybe some of the Central European and Baltic partners. So that will be something very interesting to follow. I want to give the word now back to Christy, who probably has something to react upon what you just said, but I would add another question with regards to I want to go a little bit more into this question of U.S. security guarantees, because there had been a lot of op-eds also now in the wake of Afghanistan that this might also be a blow to NATO's credibility, and maybe Baltic countries should feel less safe about the U.S. security guarantees than they had been in the past. At the same time, there is clearly this pull also to look at crisis management operations in the EU context. As Benjamin described, the refugee crisis also paints a different security picture, not just for the southern European member states, but also for the states more here in the Nordic Baltic region. So I guess my question really aims at, again, like checking whether you see a certain shift also in strategic culture in the Baltic states connected to this changing landscape around Europe, or if the focus almost exclusively still remains on Russia. Where are the points of movements that you can see?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this was a broad question. I mean, first, I would disagree that the focus is only on Russia. I mean, as I explained already, I think it is very well recognized in Estonia, I think more than the other two Baltic states, that we need to engage in other areas and take part in addressing security concerns that are priorities of our allies. It's just that if we don't talk about the Russian existential threat to us, who else does? Of course, that's always the number one issue, and that's always the first thing you hear from us, but it's not the only thing where Estonia contributes. But now on what is happening to thinking about the US security guarantees, I already mentioned, of course, there is this question in the air. Should we be more worried than before? How certain, how long-term the commitment is? But one way to see it, and you can make different arguments, and it's really too early to draw conclusions in this kind of post-Afghanistan withdrawal context. But one way to approach it is to focus on the vital national interests, as Benjamin also mentioned. And I think we can quite safely say that NATO is a vital national interest for the US. So in that sense, we really cannot draw a parallel between what is happening to the US commitment in Afghanistan and what is happening to the US commitment to NATO allies. And some people would also argue that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is something that allows the US to focus more on other priorities. Of course, mainly it's China and the Indo-Pacific, but Russia also remains among the priorities, not among the very top, but among the priorities of the US. So you can kind of try to put a positive spin on it. Then again, what is of concern is the way the withdrawal was managed unilaterally and leaving various European allies really taken aback and surprised. And also looking at simply the mismanagement of the process, or how it simply did not go well, and it makes you wonder how the leading major power that has put so much resources into this particular operation can in the end withdraw in such a badly managed way. So these are the points of concern. And what I also want to mention, kind of reflecting on what Benjamin was talking about, of course, it's not only the US being present in the Eastern Flank. Majority of NATO allies are contributing to the enhanced forward presence, which has been created after 2014. And hopefully we see this process of strengthening of the contribution of European allies. It's just that if the situation becomes really critical, it will be the commitment of the US that matters more than anything else. And as I explained before, this simply has to do with the actual capabilities that different allies can then put into play. Maybe I stop here. There are some other things I want to pick up, but let's move ahead with the discussion.
Okay, well, maybe it's a good point of time now to introduce some of the points raised in the chat function, which is already active, but please, if you have questions, you can still put them into the chat. So we have a question by Akseli Mampa from the Regional State Administration Preparedness Sector. So he states that the 2020s has seen a general decline of many international frameworks. He points to the example of Afghanistan, where the evacuation efforts were done actually by nation states and not even NATO, let alone the EU or CSDP were the right frameworks. And we of course also saw other ad hoc driven interventions when we look, for example, at Syria and other places. So the state focus when it comes to international security issues is of course quite highlighted. So his questions is now, do you think this undermines the concept of strategic autonomy by multinational non-state actors as a whole? So is it not something that's only a problem by the EU, but is it rather a larger institutional problem that we see in terms of international coordination? So that, and let me maybe add to that one question as well, more concrete. So we saw now by Borrell today this op-ed, as I mentioned already in the opening words, where he states this proposal of a rapid intervention force of 5,000 people as one thing the EU could get more active. So, well, my first question would be, what do you think of proposals that are along the lines of multinational armies or multinational intervention forces? And the other question is, what actually do you think the EU could otherwise contribute to enhance European defense capabilities? Where do you see the EU as a defense actor? So, and the second question in the chat is by Lula Rosso from VTT. That's a think tank focusing on technological issues here in Finland. And he points out that we shouldn't only focus on military defense issues, but there are other issues where the EU is actually playing maybe a bigger role. He mentions the EU industrial policy, and we also know, of course, that when it comes to defense industries, there's a lot of activity going on in harmonizing EU defense industries and fostering innovation. He also mentions emerging technologies and research on this and these things. Unfortunately, there's no question there, but you know, if you could maybe elaborate on this role of other non-military threats and how the EU could play a role in this, or the EU/Europe. And then maybe we start with those before I turn to Charlie's question, which I'm sure is very good, but I haven't started reading it yet. So. Benjamin, maybe you start. Yeah.
Sure. Two really interesting and complex questions. On the first one, yeah, I think that's a good read of the situation. And there's been a general erosion of multilateralism in international organizations in the last decade. I mean, we could talk about the fact that a lot of the trade talk goes outside of the WTO, and the U.S. hasn't renewed appellate judges at the WTO level. The failing role of the World Health Organization last year. I mean, a lot of examples also could be used here. I think it's good to be flexible, and I think it's good to be creative. One thing I wanted to say also earlier to connect to this is that we shouldn't spend too much time debating too much concepts and focus more on capabilities, missions, on what can be put on the table. And I think the French love concepts for sure, and these almost theological conversations, and they tend to dominate the transatlantic conversation. But when you talk to people in the Biden administration about the question of strategic autonomy, they're very pragmatic, and they just say, just show us concretely what that means. Like, what do you bring to the table? And I think in the same respect, we shouldn't get too bogged down creating new bureaucracies or new instruments, but mostly asking ourselves, like, what do we want to do, and where can we pool resources and forces to act? And here, I think sometimes having states acting together, but with a sense of solidarity and a sense of support for a broader European interest, is sometimes a better way than going through the European Commission, for example. And I say this also because one of the key things we'll have to do in the next few years is find a way to work with the United Kingdom. And maybe Afghanistan has been a way to put some of the wounds of Brexit behind us. We've seen clearly, and the truth is, when you look even in the last few years on a lot of strategic issues, whether it's JCPOA or Middle Eastern issues more generally, the British government and British public opinion is much more aligned with Europeans than it is often with the United States. But a lot of the conversation was hijacked by withdrawal agreement talks and Brexit. I think maybe the French presidency of the European Union next semester could be the opportunity to also think about a new framework on defense and security with Britain. So we'll have to think of instruments that are a little more creative or get beyond just the European Union. So having states work together can be a good idea. So this is why I'm not at all against the proposal by Borrell. I do think these take time to build, and so I'd rather see even smaller operations where we can pool special forces from different countries to fight terrorism. I'll give you an example. I mentioned Northeast Syria earlier. In 2018, when Trump withdrew, you had, I think, something like 2,500 U.S. troops in Northeast Syria working with the Kurds there. If in the 3 years that led to that, from 2016, basically his election, to 2018, Europeans together had decided to try to train 1,500, 2,000 troops to send to Northeast Syria to progressively replace Americans, had like a real coordinated plan. Now, maybe it's a little too optimistic about the way we could have done this with the Trump administration, but if progressively, I think that's clearly the kind of concrete operation also where European citizens can see the value added of this kind of investment in defense. And my guess also is that maybe that could convince Americans to stay a little longer because they could have seen more support coming from Europeans. So I would say focus on operations, focus on concrete things rather than on the bureaucratic instruments. There was a debate on Twitter today about voting at qualified majority on foreign affairs at the council. And I'm mostly favorable to this, but I'll be honest, I just don't think it's going to make a huge difference. I don't think that's what will really suddenly turn the EU into a strategic actor. I think we're focusing too much on these bureaucratic aspects. And one point on technology, I think this is a great point, and we could have talked about it more. This is where Clearly, the EU has developed a form of regulatory and normative agenda on technology. I do think it should not come at the expense of innovation. I think these two things can go hand in hand. But clearly, if you look today at patents being developed on microchips, on AI, they're in the United States, they're in China, they're in Israel. They're not so much in Europe. So that's something that we'll have to, because strategic autonomy is also about not being too dependent on others' technology. And Christy mentioned, what does China mean for our own national security? I think that's clearly something where we have to think about it when we think about 5G and Huawei. It's not about being a good ally. It is about defending our own sovereignty and actually promoting our own technology. A lot of the alternative 5G technology is European. It's not American. And so I think it is important also to think about not through regulation, but through a real pooled culture of innovation, entrepreneurship, and education, focus also on developing these technologies in Europe. And right now, I think this is also aspirational, because unfortunately we're losing ground on this.
Yeah, thanks. I think I want to underline your point that many of the more bureaucratic discussions of qualified majority voting, or what kind of institutional frameworks, are maybe not the most helpful ones in promoting also strategic culture in Europe. But to add a little question to Christy as well, I'm wondering how you saw Benjamin's point on that a lot is also depending on the informal cooperation between states, and he mentioned the example of France reaching out to the UK. So how do you see that from the perspective of a smaller state at the periphery? I mean, I don't want to overstretch the point now of like big member states cooperating versus small member states that rather want to have an institutional framework. But you see where my question aims at. Do you have this similar perspective on how to get, for example, the UK involved again in European defense issues now that they are outside of the EU? Sorry, that adds up now to many of the other questions that are already on the table, but Christy, you can pick.
Yeah, so I can pick and choose, but yes, this is a very important question, of course, from a small state perspective in particular. And it's symptomatic of what is going on in the current international system, the kind of changing balance of power and the kind of uncertainties and regroupings and growing tensions, that institutions tend to matter less. And we see especially bigger states talking a lot to each other in various formats, bilateral and minilateral. And it always then creates this uneasy feeling among the smaller ones. Are they going to agree something that has an impact on our position, on our lives, without listening to us? And that's why institutions are so important, that then we can be sure that there are these structures and mechanisms where we are around the table and our views are being heard. When the discussions go kind of outside of the institutional frameworks, it's far more difficult to make sure that that you can actually have a say and take part in the discussions. This is something that we see on very many issues. Let me just mention the Nord Stream 2, which of course in Central and Eastern Europe created a lot of bad blood, the sudden kind of German-US agreement that came out, as a surprise to Ukraine and to many countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And while I can see the value in having a better relationship between the US and Germany, of course, I mean, two key allies in NATO, it enhanced this sense that things are going on above our heads. And it kind of undermines trust, and it creates uncertainty. As a small state, I think, one has to take a very pragmatic approach and then use the avenues that are there and try to find your way to the capitals of major powers, and to develop your own relationships with all the important players in European security, and not just rely on the institutions. But then I also want to say a couple of words about, very shortly, on the EU's contribution. I mean, Niklas and myself, we have both worked on the institutional aspects of EU foreign and security policy, and we could have a whole hour just discussing that. And quite recently, we worked on a joint paper on the Nordic-Baltic views on European strategic autonomy, and we actually had this debate about the QMV, where I was also kind of hesitant about how much difference it actually makes. So quite a similar view actually to what Benjamin expressed. Not that I would be against it, but there is this tendency in EU foreign policy discussions to get carried away with rather minor institutional aspects, and especially Germany has this tendency to focus a lot on institutional settings and rules and procedures, rather than kind of asking what we can actually do with certain conflicts, let's say, next to the EU's borders. And with the QMV debate, it's anyway a debate about the very specific areas where it could potentially be used, but not a kind of broader use of QMV. This would just be politically too much for many EU member states to digest. So I don't see a solution there. And in general, it's hard not to be disappointed with the contribution that the EU has made so far to actually strengthening Europe's defense capabilities. So it's really most important still what key member states do and what the national efforts are. And then the EU can bring some added value to it. And yes, it has its role in defense industries, and there are some projects of defense cooperation, but that's not the decisive question. The decisive question is what Germany does, what France does, what other major European powers do. I will stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. I think now Daniel Hamilton joined us as well. Welcome to the discussion, and so good. I know you had to have a busy day and are driving through Central Europe, so even more I'm glad that you could join us now at this debate. So maybe I hand the floor to you next. So Dan Hamilton is, to those who don't know him, he's the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Global Euro Program at the Wilson Center. He is still affiliated also with the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., where he was for a long time also the director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations. And he also has a lot of practical experience from various positions in the State Department. And if I can add, I think also you were for some time, I think, in the planning department of the German Foreign Ministry, but that was in the 90s, I think. But so you have a really good perspective, long-term perspective on the topic we are discussing today. I'm not going to try to summarize now the ground that we already covered, but of course, as you can imagine, the recent events in Afghanistan and in the Kabul airport kind of were triggering already some discussions here about what should be the takeaways for Europe from these events. Is it, like Borrell said, another wake-up call for Europe? Why haven't previous wake-up calls from Libya to Western Balkans not have the effect, and what should we do next on European defense issues? So I just give you the floor now for your initial remarks and your reflections on this discussion of European strategic autonomy. I think there are some technical problems, probably something with the connection. then let's turn to Benjamin and Christy again, because I don't think the connection works. So Benjamin, clearly you are the representative now here in this discussion from a DC think tank. So I'm going to put now one question that I maybe would have put to Dan, now to you. When you look at the Biden administration, obviously the focus is very strongly now on China and the emerging conflicts between different systems, authoritarianism on the one hand, democratic systems on the other hand. So this great power competition is very much in the focus. At the same time, there was now this Afghanistan disaster. What has been less clear, at least from what I see from far away, is what the Biden administration strategy is for Europe. Are they really counting on Europe to take on over more responsibility, or do they want to be strongly engaged in Europe also when it comes to these questions of how to develop European defense further? Is it neglect? Is it primacy? How do you see the current discussion in Washington DC on what to do with Europe, or is there simply no discussion?
It's interesting. I mean, first, to your point, even though we all work on Europe, we're all Europeans, it is clearly not at the highest of priorities. First, once again, as I said earlier, foreign policy, I don't think is as the highest of priority. It is right now because of the focus on Afghanistan, but it hasn't been for the first 6 months of the administration. It's mostly a domestic administration. We're very ambitious economic agenda. And Europe is not at the core. However, this is a transatlanticist administration. This is an administration that believes in the multiplying force of allies for U.S. power, and that knows that comes after the Trump administration, so needs to repair the trust with allies, the credibility of U.S. commitment to NATO and Article 5. It's clearly no coincidence that the first trip the president took abroad was to the G7, the UK, and then obviously to Brussels for the summit with the EU and the NATO summit. And I think, it was low on substance, but the atmospherics were good, and that matters. The pictures matter, the trust matters, the rhetoric does matter to rebuild trust among allies and public opinions. But as I said, I mean, it wasn't really noted at the time that the substance was a little low. I think, even some irritants of the Trump administration have remained. We still have tariffs on steel and aluminum. We have a travel ban on Europeans that have been strengthened for sanitary reasons, of course, but it does create a political challenge on both sides of the Atlantic. But there is clearly in the administration that one of the key strengths of the United States in its strategic competition with China is its web of friends, partners, and allies across the world, especially the Europeans and especially the EU. And I think that's something that's really different from previous administrations like the Obama administration. There's an understanding that when it comes to the non-military dimension, the strategic competition with China, the normative agenda, trade, supply chains, IP, technology, clearly you will need to work with the main norms and standard setters in the world, that is the European Union. And so I think even though it's something very bureaucratic and it still needs to be implemented, I do think there's promise in the Tech and Trade Council, which was announced at the summit with the European Union. If we do manage to build convergence on these norms and standards to how we think about technology, that will create a common space and common front to push back against Chinese digital authoritarianism. And so I do think that's one of the key challenges, and the Biden administration does put this very high on the agenda. I sees its a cooperation with the EU in this respect. So I think that's a key element. And we talked already about the commitment to NATO, I think is strong and serious. But I do think on the rest, on all the security challenges that affect Europeans more than they affect Americans, especially in the neighborhood, there's just very limited interest and appetite right now in the US, and they will expect Europeans to step up and take responsibility for themselves.
Okay. Yes, thank you. So I take now the question from Charlie from the chat. So Charlie, who Salenius Pasternak, who opened the session today, who works here at FIA as a lead researcher and heads the CUSP, who's organizing this event. So Charlie asks, why do you think essentially only France drew the correct conclusions regarding how quickly the Afghan national security forces would cease to function and fight? So yeah, this question is clearly about another aspect of strategic autonomy, which is also to have the right intelligence and the right situational awareness. So one could argue, okay, yeah, everyone took the wrong conclusions of that, but how much does this play a role, and what was going on here? Who of the two of you wants to take up this question? And there's a second question. Many states have felt that they feel uncomfortable with an EU army due to various reasons, democratic deficits and other issues. So what's your point of view on whether some kind of new EU defense framework might be really the right answer? And here Axel cites, for example, the Western European Union from the 90s, but of course nowadays the defense union is discussed very much. So it ties into the question earlier. Can be these institutional approaches to European defense cooperation, can those really bring a benefit? So those two questions. Christy, do you want to start?
Well, I can pick up on this issue of European or EU army. I think the question of France and Afghanistan, I leave for Benjamin, who I'm sure knows much more about it than myself. But maybe we have Dan now online again. Should we try if we can hear?
Yeah, we can try if we get Dan. Hi, Dan. Yeah, can you hear us? Can we hear you? He's like the elephant in the room, kind of. Always there somehow in the background, but not really available. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Well, then I will continue. Yeah, but this question of EU army, I think it's a good example of how the discussions on European strategic autonomy somehow get caught in these conceptual arguments and misunderstandings and misleading concepts, and not really talking about more practical, concrete threats and how to deal with them. There is no plan to create an EU army. There is no NATO army. I mean, there are national armies of states, and then there are some shared capabilities that can be strengthened. But this nation-state-based kind of system in the field of security and defense is still a reality in Europe, in spite of the degree of integration that we have achieved in the past decades. This has been one of the misunderstandings created by the French emphasis on European strategic autonomy, that suddenly, the French president talking about an EU army raises this question. So is there going to be some major new push to create something new? And we don't quite understand what is meant by it, and how does it relate to NATO, and how could something like this be created? And it's just creating a lot of confusion. So unfortunately, I mean, the way the French have kind of pushed ahead this strategic autonomy debate, it has often been unhelpful. So I get back again to this point that actually my eyes are now very much on Germany, especially when I think about the Eastern European, Central and Eastern European security concerns. So how much more responsibility is Germany ready to take to actually be a major player in providing security in the eastern flank of NATO?
Yeah, thank you. let's try it one last time, Dan, because now it seems actually there is some kind of connection, but let's see if we can hear you.
I'm sorry, it's just an awful connection. I hope I can, I'm so sorry to come in late. And I'm probably repeating now what Ben or others have said. Let me just try to be very brief. I think the situation devolved into some blame game among the allies. The reality is NATO went in together and out together. There's enough blame to go around. And that the Europeans are frankly just as complicit as the Americans in the abandonment of Afghanistan. It also revealed how dependent Europe is. It also showed completely different strategic cultures among European forces, different capabilities, very different structure of forces, very different rules of engagement. And that, as much as anything, hinders some type of European, so-called strategic autonomy. I think the term just gets in the way. I think I just agree with what I just heard her say. It doesn't help us. We should just get rid of that. Let's agree on what I think what we can agree on is we want a more capable Europe, period. That's what we want. We all want that. We saw how incapable Europe is in the last few weeks. We've seen its challenges also, as I heard earlier, also Libya, the Sahel, and so on. The United States would be the first to welcome a more capable European partner to do a whole bunch of things the Americans don't think they should be having to do anymore. But we're not there. And this buzzword sort of, distracts us from the real issue, which is what kind of capabilities can Europeans produce in a real time that would enhance their capability to deal with issues. So my suggestion is, use the jargon, use the words that NATO or the EU itself use. NATO has something called a level of ambition. It's a formal way of organizing itself. There should be a European level of ambition. The Europeans should decide what that is. My own 2 cents is Europe should be the first responder. Think of Europe as a first responder to crises in and around its neighborhood. NATO's still there, but for crisis management issues, it's probably not what you would turn to first. And the Europeans could build the kind of capabilities tailored to crisis management to be the first responder. I think the United States would welcome that. But you'd have to define exactly what that means. That means creating the kind of capabilities that now Europe does not have. Why do American airplanes still fly French forces to the Sahel? What about logistics and communications? There are a whole set of issues that are very clear where Europe needs to do better, or particular European countries need to do better, and also align their cultures and the other kinds of things that I mentioned. There's no European army. As Christy said, there's no NATO army. These are national forces. The French would be the last to integrate their forces into a NATO army. So it just distracts us. Long ago, we tried to solve this with a simple term of separable but not separate forces. That is, if NATO chooses not to engage, the Europeans should be able to engage and draw on NATO if they didn't have them themselves. That still seems to be eminent sense. Why have we gotten away from that? Autonomy has this pejorative term. It seems to imply you are trying to be less tied to the United States. And I realize that maybe not be what some want, but I don't think it has any consensus within Europe, the EU, the term itself. I have many European colleagues call me and say, what does this mean? They're confused by it. And also the strategic piece of autonomy. Strategic to me implies nuclear weapons. Is France ready to extend its nuclear deterrent to the rest of the EU? I doubt it. Macron has shied away from that many times. He plays with the words, but then doesn't do much. So let's focus on where I think we agree. A more capable Europe, and then define those in the ways that the military does that in terms of level of ambition, think of being a first responder and then deciding on the exact capabilities that would get you from here to there. It would take at least a decade, if not more. We have to be realistic. This is not going to happen anytime soon. But that would be my proposal.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan. Also to underline once more that the gulf between the US and Europe when it comes to capabilities is really quite deep. And I think this is something that is widely acknowledged in Europe, but still there are some questions about how to get better on capabilities and how to coordinate better, how to spend more seems to be politically also difficult in some of the member states, as you know. I now want to give also the final word to Benjamin still before we have to actually close the seminar. And maybe 1 or 2 minutes. There was still this one question on situational and awareness and what role that played in the Afghanistan disaster. But if you have any other kind of reaction still to the panel, this is the last opportunity.
Yeah, on Afghanistan, it's interesting. It was the first country to ask its both its citizens and its Afghan partners to leave the country. It was heavily criticized by other Europeans and NGO at the time. I think it was in May that it asked its partner, had a pretty active and visible ambassador, David Martineau, on the ground. There was a really interesting piece in the FT about what they called a dispassionate intelligence assessment and the fact that Americans trusted the Ghani people and the army too much, had invested so much in it, were maybe more distant than dispassionate. I do think that's something that will have to be looked into because it's a very interesting example. Christy talked earlier about how strategic autonomy, or however we want to call it, is also about autonomy of thinking, of assessment and analysis. And I think that's maybe a good example where maybe the French were a little less shy than other Europeans in just expressing a different assessment. If other Europeans in private maybe were also skeptical about the ability of the Afghan forces to push back against the Taliban offensive. But it's an interesting thing to look into. One thing on a point that Dan made, because I really agree on the broader picture. One slight nuance though I would bring is I don't think it's that clear that everyone in the US agrees that Europe should step up and should have more capabilities. I actually do think Americans for a long time have been a little schizophrenic about this because rhetorically asking Europeans to do more, spend more, and then always finding reasons to oppose the way Europeans were doing it. From the duplication, redundancy debates in Madeleine Albright in the 90s to the recent opposition from both sides of the political spectrum to the way PESCO and EDF were set up. And, the only way Europeans will step up and spend more will have to be if also they find a way to defend their own defense industry and develop their own defense industry. Then you just mentioned the dependency on the United States in the Sahel. I think it's a really good example. And so I think this is where the US will have maybe to sacrifice a bit, take a step back from its own industrial interests, understand that, Europeans there will be some protectionist element to it, the same way that there is a lot of protectionist element to the way the American defense industry is set up, because that's also something on which European leaders will have to show their public opinion, that it trickles down in terms of job and investment, because if you increase defense spending, especially right now, it does mean you have to make sacrifices elsewhere. And that leads me to my very last point connected to that, on the Turn European Army, to which I think a lot in the think tank community reacted, I think, a little too harshly. None of us has to run for office. This was in the context of the European elections in France. But to be honest, I mean, sometimes you do need to say things in a way that's a little more direct than PESCO and EDF. And, the reasons why pro-Europeans often lose against populists is because if on the one hand you have people talking about independence and sovereignty and borders, and on the other hand you only hear technocratic jargon, you're going to lose the fight. And so I think I do agree that it's confusing, but I also think we shouldn't overreact to things that are said, just to promote a European agenda in domestic politics. Macron's been good at this, especially in his 2017 presidential campaign, get people waving European flags in rallies, never been seen before, especially from mainstream candidates. So I think it's important. I mean, it's also our responsibility, I would say, to find a way to make these debates accessible.
Thank you so much. That was a good end to this seminar, which I have to close now. But I thought it was a really interesting exchange. I also saw many interventions of the three of you, where you also critically reflected on the position of maybe the country you know best. So I think this was really an open and very fruitful conversation about where we stand on this issue of European strategic autonomy, or however you want to call it, and what are actually the things where we are not so far away from each other and actually want to pursue in the same direction. I'm sorry about the technical problems. I'm also sorry about to apologize that we went a couple of minutes over time, but thank you so much. I close now this seminar, and I hope we all stay in touch and see how this further develops. Bye.